The morning sun cast long shadows across the small-town diner's parking lot as Harold Martinez carefully maneuvered his weathered pickup truck into a space near the front entrance. At 68, every movement was deliberate, calculated by decades of military precision and the gradual acknowledgement that his body no longer moved with the fluid grace of his younger years. The arthritis in his knees protested as he climbed down from the driver's seat, but Harold had learned long ago not to let physical discomfort dictate his daily routine. The diner itself was a relic from another era, its chrome exterior gleaming despite decades of service to the small community of Millbrook. Red vinyl booths lined the windows, and the smell of bacon grease and fresh coffee drifted through the screen door as Harold approached. This place had been his sanctuary for the past 3 years, ever since Mary passed away and the silence in their house became too heavy to bear alone. Inside, the familiar sounds of small-town morning conversation greeted him like an old friend. The waitress, Sandra, looked up from wiping down the counter with a genuine smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. She was probably in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of easy warmth that made strangers feel like family. "Morning, Harold," she called out, already reaching for the coffee pot. "Your usual table's waiting for you." Harold nodded his appreciation and made his way to the corner booth where he'd claimed unofficial ownership over the past few years. The vinyl squeaked softly as he settled in, his back to the wall in a habit that would never leave him, no matter how many years passed since his last deployment. From this position, he could see the entire diner, the front door, and the parking lot beyond. Old habits from a young soldier's training died hard, if they died at all. Sandra appeared at his elbow with practiced efficiency, setting down a steaming mug of black coffee and pulling her order pad from her apron pocket. "The usual, hon? 2 eggs over easy wheat toast and a side of bacon." "That sounds perfect, Sandra." "Thank you." Harold's voice carried the slight rasp that came with age and too many years of shouting orders over military engines and gunfire. "How's your grandson doing with his college applications?" "Oh, you remember that?" Sandra's face lit up with the pride that only grandmothers could properly display. "He got into 3 schools so far, including that engineering program he wanted. Still waiting to hear back from his top choice, but I think he's got a real good shot." "That's wonderful news. You raised him right." Harold meant every word. In a world that seemed increasingly disconnected from the values he'd spent his life defending, Sandra's family represented something precious and worth protecting. As Sandra bustled away to place his order, Harold allowed himself to settle into the comfortable routine of his morning. He pulled out the worn paperback novel he'd been working through, a mystery set in post-war Europe that reminded him of places he'd seen decades earlier when the world was a very different place. The coffee was hot and strong, exactly the way he preferred it, and for a few precious moments, the small troubles and larger sorrows of his life seemed manageable. The peaceful atmosphere shattered like glass when the front door crashed open with unnecessary force. 3 men entered the diner with the kind of aggressive swagger that immediately put Harold's instincts on high alert. They wore leather jackets, despite the warm morning temperature, and their clothes and demeanor suggested they belonged to one of the motorcycle clubs that occasionally passed through town on their way to larger cities. The leader of the group was a mountain of a man, easily 6 feet 4 inches tall, and built like someone who'd spent more time lifting weights than reading books. Intricate tattoos covered his visible skin, and a thick beard framed a face that seemed permanently set in a scowl. His companions were smaller, but no less intimidating, and they moved with the practiced coordination of men accustomed to using their physical presence to get what they wanted. Well, the big man announced loudly enough for everyone in the diner to hear. "Looks like we found ourselves some real hometown hospitality." His voice carried a mocking edge that made Harold's jaw tighten involuntarily. The conversation in the diner didn't stop completely, but it dropped to nervous whispers as the 3 men claimed a booth in the center of the room. Sandra approached them with the professional courtesy she showed all customers, but Harold could see the tension in her shoulders as she prepared to take their order. "What can I get you gentlemen this morning?" she asked, her voice maintaining its usual warmth despite the circumstances. "Gentlemen," the leader laughed harshly, and his companions joined in with a kind of forced enthusiasm that suggested they were more followers than friends. "Did you hear that, boys? She thinks we're gentlemen." He looked Sandra up and down a way that made Harold's hands clench in a fist beneath the table. "Tell you what, sweetheart, bring us 3 coffees and whatever breakfast special you got. And make sure it's hot. We've been riding all night, and we're in the mood for some real service." The emphasis he placed on the word service left no doubt about the kind of establishment he thought he was in, and Harold watched Sandra's face flush with embarrassment and anger. She maintained her composure with admirable professionalism, but Harold could see the way her hands trembled slightly as she wrote down their order. "I'll have that right out for you," she said simply, and turned to head back to the kitchen. "Hold on there, darling," the big man called after her, his voice carrying just loudly enough to ensure the entire diner could hear every word. "We didn't get a chance to properly introduce ourselves. Name's Tank, and these are my associates, Razor and Snake. We're what you might call traveling businessmen, and we believe in supporting local establishments wherever we go." The way he said supporting made it sound more like a threat than a promise, and Harold noticed several other customers glancing nervously toward the door as if calculating their chances of leaving without attracting unwanted attention. Sandra forced a smile and nodded politely. "Well, we appreciate your business. I'll get that order started for you right away." As she hurried toward the kitchen, Tank's attention wandered around the diner, taking in the other customers with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating potential prey. His eyes lingered on an elderly couple sharing a quiet breakfast near the window, passed over a middle-aged man in a business suit who was studiously avoiding eye contact, and finally settled on Harold. "Well, looky here," Tank announced, his voice carrying a note of mock surprise. "We got ourselves a genuine war hero in the house." He'd spotted the small American flag pin on Harold's shirt collar and the military bearing that no amount of time could fully erase from a soldier's posture. Harold kept his eyes focused on his book, though he'd stopped reading minutes earlier. Every instinct he'd developed over 25 years of military service was screaming warnings, but at 68 years old and sitting alone in a civilian diner, his options were limited. The smart play was to avoid confrontation, finish his breakfast, and leave quietly. "I'm talking to you, old-timer," Tank called out when Harold didn't respond to his initial comment. It's rude not to acknowledge someone when they're being friendly. Harold slowly marked his place in the book and set it down on the table. When he looked up, his gray eyes met Tank's stare with the kind of steady, unflinching gaze that had once faced down enemy combatants across 3 different theaters of war. "Morning," Harold said simply, his voice calm and controlled. Tank grinned, recognizing the challenge inherent in Harold's calm demeanor. In the hierarchy of bullies and thugs, there was nothing quite as satisfying as breaking down someone who refused to show the proper amount of fear and submission. "Morning," Tank repeated with exaggerated disbelief. "That's it? No thank you for your service, or welcome to our little town? What kind of hospitality is that from one of our nation's finest?" The sarcasm in Tank's voice was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Harold could feel the attention of every other person in the diner focusing on their interaction. This was exactly the kind of situation he'd hoped to avoid when he'd chosen this quiet booth, in this quiet diner, in this quiet town. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced," Harold replied evenly, neither rising to the bait nor backing down from the obvious challenge. "Oh, we haven't, have we?" Tank pushed himself up from his booth with theatrical slowness, his impressive bulk unfolding like a mountain rising from the earth. "Well, let me remedy that situation right now." Harold remained seated, his body language relaxed, but his mind calculating distances, angles, and options with the automatic precision of someone who'd survived more genuine combat than most people could imagine. Tank's approach was textbook intimidation, designed to make Harold feel small and vulnerable while establishing dominance in front of an audience. Like I told your lovely waitress, name's Tank. He stopped directly beside Harold's table, close enough to loom over the seated veteran, but not quite close enough to constitute an actual physical threat. And you are? Harold Martinez. The name came out with simple dignity, carrying no elaboration or explanation. Harold Martinez, Tank repeated as if tasting the words. And what brings Harold Martinez to this fine establishment on this beautiful morning? Breakfast. Harold's response was direct and unadorned, refusing to be drawn into whatever game Tank was playing. Tank laughed, a sound devoid of genuine humor. Breakfast? Well, isn't that nice? Man your age probably doesn't have many simple pleasures left to enjoy, does he? The comment was designed to be insulting, playing on stereotypes about elderly people being weak, irrelevant, or somehow less valuable than younger members of society. Harold had encountered this kind of casual ageism before, usually from people who equated physical decline with mental or moral weakness. I managed to stay busy, Harold replied calmly. Oh, I bet you do, Tank continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Probably spend your days telling war stories to anyone who'll listen, talking about the good old days when you were somebody important. Must be hard, going from being a big-shot soldier to being just another old man nobody pays attention to anymore. The words hit their intended target with precision. Tank had identified exactly the kind of psychological pressure point that might cause an elderly veteran to react emotionally, either with anger or with the kind of defensive posturing that would provide additional ammunition for humiliation. Harold felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with suppressed anger, but his expression remained neutral. He'd faced down interrogators who were significantly more skilled than Tank, and he learned long ago that the best defense against verbal attacks was often simple silence. Cat got your tongue, old man. Tank pressed, emboldened by Harold's lack of response. Or maybe you're just too tired to keep up with the conversation. I heard that happens when you get to be your age. Mind starts to go, reflexes slow down, can't handle stress like you used to. Sandra appeared from the kitchen with Tank's order, but she hesitated at the edge of the dining area when she saw the confrontation unfolding. Her face showed genuine concern for Harold, but she was clearly uncertain about how to intervene without making the situation worse. Tank noticed her hesitation and used it as an opportunity to escalate his performance. Don't worry, sweetheart, he called to Sandra without taking his eyes off Harold. Me and Harold here are just having a friendly conversation about his glory days. Isn't that right, Harold? The use of his first name without permission was another calculated insult, designed to strip away dignity and establish Tank's dominance in the interaction. Harold recognized the technique because he'd seen it used by enemy interrogators and prison guards who understood that small humiliations could be just as effective as physical violence in breaking down a person's resistance. Your breakfast is getting cold, Harold said quietly, nodding towards Sandra and the plate she was holding. My breakfast can wait, Tank replied. I'm much more interested in hearing about your service record, Harold. What did you serve? Vietnam? Korea? Or maybe you were one of those desk jockeys who never saw any real action. The questions were designed to probe for information that could be used to either diminish Harold's service or create additional opportunities for mockery. Tank was fishing for details that would allow him to either dismiss Harold as a non-combat veteran or mock him for participating in unpopular conflicts. Harold remained silent, understanding that any answer he provided would simply give Tank more ammunition for his verbal assault. The smart tactical decision was to weather the storm and wait for Tank to lose interest or make a mistake that would provide an opening for de-escalation. But Tank was just getting started. He pulled out his phone and began taking pictures of Harold, holding it at various angles as if he were documenting some kind of curiosity or tourist attraction. Smile for the camera, Harold, Tank commanded with mock enthusiasm. We're going to post this on social media. Look what we found in bumfuck nowhere. A genuine antique warrior, still clinging to his coffee and his memories. The photography was a new level of harassment, designed to create lasting humiliation and potentially expose Harold to ongoing mockery from Tank's associates and social media followers. It crossed the line from verbal harassment into something approaching stalking or threatening behavior. Harold slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a $10 bill, placing it carefully on the table next to his unfinished breakfast. The movement was deliberate and calm, suggesting that he intended to leave rather than escalate the confrontation. "Running away, old man," Tank taunted, moving to block Harold's path to the door. "What happened to all that military courage? Thought you soldier boys were supposed to stand and fight." Harold stood slowly, his movements careful and controlled. Despite the arthritis in his joints and the decades since his last combat deployment, there was something in his posture that suggested Tank might have seriously misjudged his opponent. Harold was several inches shorter and probably 60 pounds lighter than Tank, but there was a quality to his stillness that spoke of competence and experience that went far beyond physical size. "Excuse me," Harold said politely, indicating that he wanted to pass. Tank grinned and planted himself more firmly in Harold's path. "I don't think so, Harold. We're not finished with our conversation yet. You haven't told us about your war stories, and we're all very interested in hearing about the heroic adventures of Harold Martinez." The confrontation had reached a tipping point. Tank had committed himself to a course of action that required him to either back down and lose face in front of his companions and the other diner patrons, or escalate to physical confrontation with a 68-year-old veteran. From Tank's perspective, the choice seemed obvious. What possible threat could an elderly man pose to someone with his size and apparent physical advantages? Harold measured the distance between himself and Tank, calculated the positions of Tank's companions, noted the locations of other customers who might become collateral damage in a physical altercation, and weighed his options with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent decades making life and death tactical decisions under pressure. The situation was about to change dramatically, though none of the people in the diner could have predicted exactly how those changes would unfold. Outside in the parking lot, the distinctive sound of a military vehicle pulling up suggested that Harold's morning was about to become significantly more complicated than anyone could have imagined. The engine noise was different from civilian vehicles, deeper, more powerful, and carrying the unmistakable authority of official government transportation. Through the diner windows, the distinctive olive-drab color of a military Humvee became visible as it maneuvered into the parking lot with practiced efficiency. Tank heard the engine noise, but didn't immediately understand its significance. His attention remained focused on Harold, who had become completely still in a way that suggested he was listening to something beyond the immediate confrontation. "Problem, Harold?" Tank asked with mock concern. "You look like you just saw a ghost." Harold's expression had indeed changed, though not in the way Tank interpreted it. There was something approaching relief in his gray eyes, mixed with a kind of anticipation that suggested he recognized the sound of that particular engine and understood what its arrival might mean for the current situation. The Humvee's doors opened with mechanical precision, and the sound of military boots on asphalt carried clearly through the diner's windows. Tank's companions had noticed the vehicle's arrival and were exchanging uncertain glances, their earlier confidence beginning to show cracks as they processed the implications of an official military presence in their previously controlled environment. Harold looked directly at Tank for the first time since the confrontation began, and there was something in his expression that made the larger man take an involuntary step backward. "You might want to return to your breakfast," Harold said quietly, "before it gets cold." The diner's front door opened with a measured authority that only comes from military training. The man who entered was clearly a soldier, though he wore dress uniform rather than combat gear. Staff Sergeant Michael Chun was 32 years old, with the lean build of someone who maintained peak physical condition as a matter of professional necessity. His uniform was pressed to razor-sharp creases, his boots polished to mirror brightness, and every visible detail spoke of the kind of attention to precision that characterized career military personnel. Chen's dark eyes swept the diner's interior with practiced efficiency, taking in the layout, the occupants, and the obvious tension that hung in the air like smoke. His gaze lingered on Tank and his companions for approximately 2 seconds, long enough to catalog them as potential threats, but not long enough to suggest immediate concern. When his eyes found Harold, something shifted in his expression, a combination of recognition and respect that changed the entire dynamic of the room. "Sir," Chun said, his voice carrying across the diner with crisp military formality. He moved toward Harold's table with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to command situations. Tank found himself caught in an awkward position, still blocking Harold's path, but now facing the uncomfortable reality that his target apparently had connections he hadn't anticipated. The arrival of an active-duty soldier in dress uniform wasn't part of any scenario Tank had prepared for, and he could feel his carefully constructed dominance slipping away. Well, Tank said, attempting to maintain his aggressive posture despite the changed circumstances. "Looks like Grandpa called for backup. What's the matter, Harold? Couldn't handle a simple conversation without running to the military for help?" Chin stopped 3 feet from Tank, close enough to establish his presence, but far enough to avoid any appearance of immediate aggression. His posture was relaxed but alert, and anyone with military experience would have recognized the stance as that of someone prepared for rapid action, if circumstances required it. "I'm Staff Sergeant Chun," he announced clearly, his voice pitched to carry throughout the diner. "I'm here on official business with Sergeant Major Martinez." The title hit the room like a physical force. Several customers who had been nervously watching the confrontation straightened in their chairs, and Sandra's face showed a mixture of surprise and newfound respect. Tank's companions exchanged uncertain glances, clearly uncomfortable with this unexpected development. Tank himself seemed momentarily stunned by the revelation that the elderly man he'd been harassing carried a military rank that commanded automatic respect from active-duty personnel. Sergeant Major was a position that represented decades of service and the kind of leadership experience that made colonels and generals pay attention when you spoke. "Sergeant Major?" Tank repeated, his voice showing the first cracks in its confident facade. This old man," Chin replied with quiet intensity, "is a decorated veteran with 25 years of active service, including 3 combat deployments and a Congressional Medal of Honor nomination. He's also my former commanding officer and the reason I'm alive today." The words fell into the diner's silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that reached every corner of the room. Harold's face showed no change in expression, but there was something in his posture that suggested he would prefer this information not be shared so publicly. Tank's swagger was evaporating rapidly as he processed the implications of Chen's statement. Harassing an elderly veteran was one thing. Publicly humiliating a Medal of Honor nominee in front of an active-duty soldier was something else entirely, and Tank was beginning to understand that he'd seriously misjudged the situation. "Look, I don't want any trouble," Tank said, his tone shifting towards something approaching conciliation. "We were just having a friendly conversation with Harold here. Nothing serious." Chin's expression remained neutral, but his eyes had taken on the kind of coldness that suggested he'd assessed Tank's character and found it lacking. "From what I observed, your conversation didn't appear particularly friendly." "You observe?" Tank asked, confusion replacing his earlier confidence. "I was having breakfast in the Humvee, reviewing some paperwork while I waited for the sergeant major to finish his meal," Chun explained with military precision. "I had a clear view of your interaction through the window." Tank realized with growing unease that his entire performance had been witnessed by someone with both the authority and the inclination to make his life significantly more difficult. Military personnel took veteran harassment seriously, and Tank had just discovered that his target wasn't simply an isolated elderly man, but someone with active connections to current service members. "Maybe we got off on the wrong foot," Tank tried again, his voice now carrying notes of actual nervousness. "I didn't realize Harold was such an important guy. No disrespect intended." Harold finally, spoke, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded respect from hundreds of soldiers under his leadership. "Sergeant Chun, I believe these gentlemen were just finishing their breakfast and preparing to continue their journey." It was a gracious offer of de-escalation, providing Tank and his companions with an opportunity to withdraw without further confrontation. But Chun wasn't entirely satisfied with allowing the harassment to end without consequences. "Sergeant Major, with respect, I don't think these individuals understand the significance of what they were doing," Chin said carefully. "Maybe they need some education about veteran affairs and military protocol." Tank's face had gone pale as he began to comprehend that he wasn't simply dealing with an elderly man with military connections, but with someone whose service record commanded genuine respect from active duty personnel. The playful harassment had become something much more serious, and Tank was discovering that his usual intimidation tactics were completely ineffective against people with actual military training and experience. "I think we understand perfectly," Tank said quickly, his voice now carrying genuine desperation. "We respect our veterans. We support the troops. This whole thing was just a misunderstanding." Chun studied Tank with the kind of clinical assessment that combat veterans used when evaluating potential threats. "A misunderstanding? I watched you photograph the sergeant major without his permission, block his movement, and make derogatory comments about his age and service record. Which part of that was misunderstood?" The systematic recitation of Tank's behavior made it clear that Chun had been paying close attention to the entire confrontation, and that he understood exactly what kind of harassment Harold had been subjected to. Tank was beginning to realize that his actions had been witnessed and cataloged by someone with both the training and the authority to respond appropriately. "Look, soldier boy," Tank said, attempting to reassert some measure of dominance despite his deteriorating position. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but this is civilian territory. You can't just waltz in here and start throwing your weight around." The comment was a mistake that revealed Tank's fundamental misunderstanding of military culture and protocol. Chin's expression didn't change, but something in the air around him seemed to grow colder and more focused. "You're absolutely right," Chin replied with dangerous calm. "This is civilian territory, which means civilian laws apply. Harassment, intimidation, and photography without consent are all violations that can be addressed through civilian law enforcement. Would you prefer that I contact the local sheriff's department to discuss your behavior?" Tank realized with growing panic that he'd maneuvered himself into a no-win situation. His attempt at intimidation had backfired completely, leaving him exposed to potential legal consequences while facing opponents who possessed both the knowledge and the connections to follow through on their threats. "That won't be necessary," Tank said quickly. His earlier aggression completely disappeared. "We were just leaving anyway." "Excellent," Chin replied. "But before you go, I think you owe Sergeant Major Martinez an apology for your behavior." The demand for an apology was delivered in the tone of voice that military personnel used when giving orders that were not actually optional. Tank found himself caught between his desire to maintain some shred of dignity and his growing understanding that he had no leverage left in this confrontation. Harold intervened again, his voice carrying the kind of command presence that had once led men through combat zones. "That won't be necessary, Sergeant Chun. I'm sure these gentlemen understand that their behavior was inappropriate, and I'm confident they'll be more respectful in future interactions with veterans and civilians alike." It was another gracious offer of resolution, but it came with an underlying message that was clear to everyone in the diner. Harold was demonstrating the kind of leadership and moral authority that had made him an effective military commander, while simultaneously making it clear that Tank's behavior had been noted and would be remembered. Tank nodded rapidly, eager to accept any resolution that didn't involve law enforcement or further military intervention. "Yes, absolutely. We definitely understand. Complete respect for veterans. Always." Chin wasn't entirely satisfied with this resolution, but he understood Harold's preference for de-escalation over confrontation. Military training emphasized achieving objectives with minimal unnecessary conflict, and Harold's objective was simply to finish his breakfast in peace. In that case, Chin said formally, I suggest you gentlemen collect your meal and continue your journey. I'm sure you have important business to attend to elsewhere. Tank and his companions moved toward their table with obvious relief, their earlier swagger completely absent. They grabbed their plates and headed for the door with the kind of hasty retreat that suggested they understood exactly how close they'd come to serious trouble. As they reached the exit, Tank paused and looked back at Harold with something approaching genuine curiosity. Sergeant Major? What did you do in the war? Harold looked up from his coffee with the same steady gaze that had faced down Tank's initial aggression. My job. The simple response carried more weight than any detailed recitation of military accomplishments could have provided. Tank nodded once and left without another word, followed by his companions who seemed eager to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the diner. Chun watched them through the window as they mounted their motorcycles and departed with significantly less noise and drama than their arrival had produced. Only when their engines had faded completely did he turn his attention back to Harold. Permission to join you, Sergeant Major? Chun asked with formal military courtesy. Harold gestured to the empty seat across from him. Of course, Michael. And you can drop the rank. We're both civilians in here. Chun sat down, but maintained his respectful posture. With respect, sir, you'll always be Sergeant Major to me. And after what I just witnessed, you're definitely not just another civilian. Sandra appeared at their table with obvious relief, carrying a fresh coffee pot and an additional mug. Her face showed a mixture of gratitude and newfound respect as she poured Chen's coffee and refilled Harold's cup. I want to thank you both, she said quietly. Those men were making everyone uncomfortable, and I didn't know what to do about it. You handled yourself with perfect professionalism, Harold replied. That kind of grace under pressure is admirable. Chen nodded his agreement. Dealing with aggressive customers is never easy, but you maintained your dignity and kept the situation from escalating. That takes real courage. Sandra's face flushed with pleasure at the compliments. Well, I've been doing this for 20 years, but I've never had customers quite like that before. I'm just glad you were here, Sergeant Chun. Actually, Chun said with a slight smile, I think Sergeant Major Martinez had everything well under control before I arrived. I just provided some additional context for those gentlemen's education. Harold sipped his coffee thoughtfully. They weren't bad men, just young and trying to prove something to themselves and each other. A little guidance and perspective usually solves that kind of problem without anyone getting hurt. Chen studied Harold's face with obvious admiration. Even after what they put you through, you're giving them the benefit of the doubt. That's exactly the kind of leadership I remember from Afghanistan. The mention of Afghanistan brought a brief shadow across Harold's expression, but he managed a small smile. Different circumstances, same principles. People usually respond better to respect than to force, whether you're dealing with hostile populations or confused young men on motorcycles. Sandra refilled both their cups again and retreated to give them privacy, but not before placing her hand briefly on Harold's shoulder in a gesture of respect and gratitude that needed no words. Chen leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a more conversational tone. How have you been, Sergeant Major? I know the transition to civilian life can be challenging. Harold considered the question carefully before answering. Some days are better than others. The routines help, and places like this provide a sense of community that makes it easier to find purpose outside of military service. I can understand that, Chen replied. I've got 8 more years before retirement, but I think about it sometimes. What's going to be like when I don't have the structure and mission that military life provides? The mission doesn't end, Harold said quietly. It just changes form. Service to community, mentoring young people, being available when someone needs experience and guidance. The uniform changes, but the commitment remains the same. Chen nodded thoughtfully. Is that why you moved to Millbrook? To find a community where you could continue serving. Partly, Harold admitted, but mostly because Mary and I always planned to retire somewhere quiet, where we could enjoy simple pleasures like morning coffee and friendly conversation. After she passed, I decided to honor that plan, even if I had to do it alone. The mention of Harold's late wife brought a respectful silence to their conversation. Chen had served under Harold's command long enough to know that the sergeant major's marriage had been one of the anchors that kept him grounded through multiple deployments and the stresses of military leadership. She would have been proud of how you handled that situation, Chen said softly. Calm, dignified, focused on de-escalation rather than confrontation. Classic Martinez leadership style. Harold's smile was genuine but touched with sadness. Mary always said that the best victories were the ones where nobody got hurt and everyone learned something valuable. I try to honor that wisdom in everything I do. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Harold's breakfast, which Sandra had kept warm in the kitchen during the confrontation. She set the plate down with obvious care, making sure everything was arranged perfectly. On the house, she announced firmly when Harold reached for his wallet. After what you did for all of us this morning, breakfast is the least we can do to show our appreciation. Harold started to protest, but Sandra held up her hand with the kind of determined expression that suggested further argument would be futile. I insist. And, Sergeant Shun, what can I get you for breakfast? It's on the house for you too. Shun ordered eggs and toast, and Sandra bustled away with obvious pleasure at having the opportunity to show her gratitude through the simple act of providing a good meal. The diner had returned to its normal atmosphere of quiet morning conversation, but there was an underlying sense of community and shared experience that hadn't been present before the confrontation. Harold ate his breakfast with obvious enjoyment, savoring both the food and the companionship of someone who understood his background and experience. Shun matched his pace, and they talked quietly about mutual friends from their military service, current events, and the challenges and rewards of small-town life. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher into a cloudless sky, and the parking lot gradually filled with the vehicles of regular customers who had no idea they'd missed witnessing a masterclass in conflict resolution and military leadership. The day was beginning exactly as Harold had hoped it would when he'd first pulled into the diner's parking lot. But neither Harold nor Chun could have predicted that their quiet breakfast was about to be interrupted by developments that would transform their peaceful morning into something much more significant and far-reaching than either of them could have imagined. The peace that had settled over the diner after Tank's departure was interrupted by the sound of Chen's phone buzzing urgently against the table. He glanced at the display, and Harold noticed the immediate change in his posture as he read the incoming message. Problem? Harold asked, recognizing the signs of someone receiving urgent military communications. Chen's face had taken on the focused expression that came with processing unexpected operational information. I'm not sure yet, Sergeant Major. Apparently, there's been an incident about 15 miles north of here on Highway 47. Multiple casualties, possible terrorist involvement, and local emergency services are requesting military assistance. Harold set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. What kind of incident? Report is sketchy, Chen replied, scrolling through additional messages that were arriving in rapid succession. Something about a bus accident, but with circumstances that don't add up to a simple traffic collision. Local sheriff's department is treating it as a potential crime scene, and the state police are requesting someone with military experience to assess the situation. The urgency in Chen's voice was controlled but unmistakable, and Harold could see the familiar transformation that occurred when military personnel shifted from civilian interaction to operational readiness. Chen's breakfast was forgotten as he processed information and calculated response options. How can I help? Harold asked simply. Chen looked up from his phone with surprise. Sergeant Major, you're retired. This isn't your responsibility anymore. Experience doesn't retire, Harold replied, already reaching for his wallet to leave payment for his breakfast. And if there are people who need help, rank and age becomes secondary considerations. Chun hesitated for a moment, clearly wrestling with protocols that discouraged involving retired personnel in active situations. But Harold's offer came from someone whose judgment and capabilities have been tested under the most demanding circumstances imaginable, and Chun knew that bureaucratic considerations should never override practical necessity. The situation is still developing, Chun said carefully. We don't know what we're walking into, and there's no official authorization for civilian involvement. Harold stood slowly, his movements betraying none of the arthritis that had been troubling him earlier. I'm not asking for official authorization, Michael. I'm asking if you could use an extra pair of experienced eyes and steady hands in a situation where people might be hurt and scared. The offer was typical of Harold's approach to leadership and service, focused on results rather than regulations, willing to take personal risks to help others, and confident enough in his own abilities to volunteer for dangerous situations despite his age and retired status. Chun made his decision with the kind of rapid calculation that military training encouraged in time-sensitive situations. Yes, sir, I could definitely use your help. But I need to be clear that this is completely unofficial, and you're under no obligation to involve yourself in what could be a dangerous situation. Harold was already moving toward the door. Understood. Let's go see what we can do. Sandra watched their departure with obvious concern, but also with the kind of pride that came from knowing that her community was served by people willing to respond when others needed help. She waved goodbye from behind the counter, and Harold touched the brim of his cap in acknowledgement as they headed toward Chin's Humvee. The military vehicle started with the powerful rumble that characterized government transportation, and Chin maneuvered out of the parking lot with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to rapid deployment. As they accelerated toward Highway 47, he brought Harold up to speed on the limited information available. Initial report came from a passing motorist who called 911 about 20 minutes ago. Chin explained, his voice raised slightly over the engine noise. School bus off the road, significant damage, multiple injuries. But when the first sheriff's deputy arrived, he found evidence that suggested this wasn't a simple accident. What kind of evidence? Harold asked, automatically checking his seatbelt and noting their speed and direction. Motorcycle tracks leading away from the scene, debris patterns that don't match a loss of control scenario, and apparent bullet holes in the bus windshield. The deputy called for backup and requested military assistance because he's concerned about the possibility of ongoing threats to public safety. Harold processed this information with a methodical analysis that had served him well during decades of military service. Any information about casualties? Bus driver is conscious but injured. 12 passengers, mostly high school students on their way to an academic competition. For students with serious injuries, 8 with minor trauma. EMTs are on scene, but they're having to work in an unsecured area because nobody knows if the perpetrators are still in the vicinity. The situation was becoming clearer, and Harold could understand why local authorities had requested military assistance. An apparent attack on a school bus represented exactly the kind of terrorist incident that local law enforcement was often unprepared to handle, particularly when the perpetrators remained unaccounted for and potentially dangerous. Any description of the attackers? Harold asked. Chin glanced at him with an expression that suggested he'd already reached the same conclusion that was forming in Harold's mind. 3 individuals on motorcycles, wearing leather jackets, left the scene immediately after the bus went off the road. Local witness said they appeared to be celebrating as they departed. The description matched Tank and his companions so perfectly that there was no reasonable doubt about their involvement. What had begun as a simple case of veteran harassment in a diner had apparently escalated into a serious crime with multiple victims and ongoing public safety implications. Tank and his friends, Harold said grimly. That's my assessment too, Chin confirmed. Which means we have recent direct contact with the suspects, detailed observations of their behavior, and apparent capabilities, and current information about their likely direction of travel. Harold's expression had hardened into the kind of focused determination that Chin remembered from combat operations. Turn on the radio. Let's see if we can coordinate with local authorities and provide them with the information they need to track these individuals before they hurt anyone else. Chun activated the Humvee's military radio system and quickly established contact with the sheriff's department dispatcher. His communication was precise and professional, identifying himself and requesting permission to share intelligence about possible suspects in the Highway 47 incident. Sheriff's Department, this is Staff Sergeant Chun, U.S. Army, responding to your request for military assistance at the Highway 47 bus incident. I have information about 3 possible suspects that may be relevant to your investigation. The dispatcher's response crackled through the radio with obvious relief. Sergeant Chun, this is Deputy Miller. We're definitely interested in any intelligence you can provide. We've got a serious situation here, and we need all the help we can get. Chun provided a detailed description of Tank and his companions, including their physical characteristics, motorcycle details, apparent direction of travel, and behavioral observations from the diner confrontation. He also explained Harold's presence and expertise, carefully noting his retired status while emphasizing his relevant experience and recent contact with the suspects. Copy all information, Sergeant Chun. That description matches witness statement from the scene perfectly. Are you suggesting these individuals were involved in harassment activities prior to the bus incident? Harold took the radio microphone from Chun with practiced ease. Deputy Miller, this is retired Sergeant Major Martinez. I had direct contact with these individuals approximately 30 minutes ago. They demonstrated a pattern of aggression, intimidation, and disrespect for authority that's completely consistent with the kind of escalated criminal behavior you're dealing with. Sergeant Major, we've heard about you from some of our veterans here in the department. Your assessment of these individuals would be extremely valuable. Are you able to respond to the scene and provide tactical consultation? Harold exchanged glances with Chun, who nodded his approval. We're en route to your location now. ETA approximately 10 minutes. What's the current tactical situation? Scene is partially secured, but we're operating under the assumption that the suspects may still be in the area and potentially armed. EMTs are treating casualties, but they're exposed to potential sniper fire from elevated positions overlooking the crash site. We've got limited personnel and no military experience for this kind of tactical assessment. The radio conversation painted a clear picture of local law enforcement struggling to manage a complex situation that fell outside their normal operational parameters. School bus attacks were the kind of terrorist incidents that required military-style tactical thinking and specialized training that most rural sheriff's departments simply didn't possess. Understood, Deputy Miller, Harold replied. We'll coordinate with you upon arrival and provide whatever tactical support we can within the scope of our unofficial capacity. Do you have air support available for area reconnaissance? Negative on air support, Sergeant Major. State Police helicopter is en route, but ETA is 45 minutes. We're working with ground units only at this time. Chun accelerated slightly as they approached the incident location, and Harold could see emergency vehicles clustered around an overturned school bus that lay partially concealed in a roadside ditch. The scene was exactly what he'd expected based on the radio communication. Organized chaos with multiple agencies trying to coordinate rescue operations while maintaining security against unknown threats. Chun, pull over about 200 yards short of the scene, Harold instructed. We need to assess the tactical situation before we commit ourselves to any particular position or course of action. Chun immediately complied, understanding Harold's preference for careful reconnaissance before entering potentially dangerous situations. They parked the Humvee behind a cluster of sheriff's department vehicles and began their approach on foot, using available cover to minimize their exposure to potential sniper positions. Deputy Miller met them halfway to the crash site, a young officer whose tactical gear and serious expression suggested he understood the gravity of the situation despite his limited experience with terrorist incidents. He shook hands with both Harold and Chun with obvious relief. Gentlemen, I can't tell you how glad I am to see you. This situation is beyond anything we're trained to handle, and we need experienced military assessment of our security vulnerabilities. Harold studied the crash site with the methodical eye of someone accustomed to analyzing combat environments for tactical advantages and potential threats. The overturned bus was positioned in a depression that provided some concealment from elevated observation points, but it also created a potential trap if attackers decided to return to eliminate witnesses or casualties. "What's your perimeter security, Deputy Miller?" Harold asked. "We've got 4 deputies positioned at cardinal points around the scene, with instructions to maintain overwatch for suspicious vehicle or pedestrian traffic. State police have established roadblocks on Highway 47 both north and south of this location." Harold nodded approvingly. "Good basic security, but we need to consider the possibility that the attackers are familiar with this area and may approach through terrain that bypasses your road coverage. Do you have topographical maps of the surrounding area?" Miller produced a folded map from his tactical vest, and Harold spread it across the hood of a patrol car for examination. Chun joined the consultation, and together they began identifying potential approach routes that could be used by attackers seeking to return to the scene. Here, and here, Harold pointed to 3 different creek beds and ridge lines that provided concealed access to elevated positions overlooking the crash site. "If I were planning to attack emergency responders, these would be my preferred routes for establishing sniper positions." Chun studied the map with obvious concern. "We need reconnaissance of those areas before we can consider this scene truly secure. And we need to establish communications with the state police roadblocks to coordinate our security efforts." Miller's radio crackled with an urgent update from one of the perimeter deputies. "Deputy Miller, this is Jackson on the north perimeter. I've got 3 motorcycles approaching from the county road, approximately 1 mile out, and closing fast. They match the description of our suspects." Harold and Chun exchanged grim looks. Tank and his companions were apparently returning to the scene, possibly to eliminate witnesses or finish whatever they'd started with their attack on the school bus. "Deputy Miller," Harold said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to making critical decisions under pressure. "You've got about 2 minutes to decide whether you want to try to arrest these individuals for questioning or whether you want to focus on protecting the casualties and emergency personnel from additional attack." The young deputy's face showed the strain of someone being asked to make tactical decisions that were far beyond his training and experience. "What would you recommend, Sergeant Major?" Harold studied the approaching dust cloud that marked the motorcycle's rapid approach, calculated the defensive positions available around the crash site, and made the kind of rapid tactical assessment that had kept his soldiers alive through multiple combat deployments. "Set up an ambush," he said simply. "These individuals have already demonstrated their willingness to attack innocent civilians, and they're returning to a scene with multiple injured people and exposed emergency responders. They've forfeited any right to the benefit of the doubt." Chun nodded his agreement. "We use their overconfidence against them. They think they're dealing with small-town law enforcement that doesn't have the training or experience to respond effectively to their tactics." Harold was already moving toward a position that would provide both cover and a clear field of fire toward the approaching motorcycles. They're about to discover that their assessment of local capabilities was seriously flawed. Harold moved with surprising speed and precision for a 68-year-old man, his military training overriding the physical limitations that arthritis and age typically imposed. Deputy Miller watched in amazement as the retired sergeant major transformed from a mild-mannered diner customer into a tactical commander organizing defensive positions with the efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before. "Deputy Miller, position your men here and here," Harold instructed, pointing to specific locations that would provide overlapping fields of fire while maintaining cover from potential return fire. "Chun, take the elevated position behind that patrol car. You'll have the best angle on their approach route." Chun was already moving toward his assigned position, checking his sidearm and ensuring he had clear sight lines to the county road where the motorcycles would emerge. His movements carried the fluid precision of active-duty military training, and Miller could see the obvious coordination between the two veterans despite their age difference and different service periods. "What about the civilians?" Miller asked, gesturing toward the EMTs who were still working to stabilize injured students around the overturned bus. "They stay exactly where they are," Harold replied firmly. "Moving them now would expose them to additional risk, and we don't have time for a proper evacuation. Our job is to neutralize the threat before it can reach the casualties." The sound of motorcycle engines was growing louder, and Harold estimated they had less than 60 seconds before Tank and his companions would be in visual range of the crash site. He positioned himself behind a concrete culvert that provided excellent cover while maintaining a clear view of the approach route. "Remember," Harold called out to the assembled deputies, his voice carrying the calm authority that had once directed soldiers through combat operations. "These individuals have already demonstrated their willingness to use violence against innocent people. They forfeited their right to gentle treatment when they attacked a school bus full of children." Deputy Miller activated his radio to coordinate with the other units. "All units, this is Miller at the crash site. We have 3 suspects approaching on motorcycles considered armed and extremely dangerous. We're setting up an ambush position. Do not allow them to leave the area under any circumstances." The response came immediately from multiple units. "Copy, Miller. North roadblock is in position. South roadblock ready. Air support still 20 minutes out, but we'll make do with ground units." Harold checked his weapon, a .45 caliber pistol that he'd carried concealed despite his retired status, a habit that many veterans maintained long after their active service ended. The familiar weight of the weapon in his hands brought back muscle memories from thousands of hours of training and multiple combat deployments where split-second decisions meant the difference between survival and catastrophe. "Here they come," Chen announced from his elevated position, his voice calm and professional. 3 motorcycles, matching suspect descriptions, approaching at high speed. They're not showing any signs of caution or awareness of our presence. Harold could see them now. Tank's massive frame hunched over his motorcycle as he led his companions toward what they apparently believed would be an easy target. Their approach was reckless and overconfident, suggesting they expected to find only confused local authorities and helpless victims rather than organized resistance. "Wait for my signal," Harold commanded, his voice carrying clearly to all the defensive positions. "Let them get close enough that they can escape, but don't allow them to reach effective range of the casualties." The motorcycles rounded the final curve and came into full view of the crash site, their engines roaring with the kind of aggressive noise that suggested their riders were enjoying the sound of their own power. Tank was clearly visible in the lead, his leather jacket and distinctive beard making identification certain. Harold waited until the motorcycles had passed the point of no return, close enough that retreat would be impossible, but far enough from the injured students that ricochets or missed shots wouldn't endanger innocent people. His timing was perfect based on decades of experience with tactical situations where precision and judgment were matters of life and death. "Now," Harold said quietly into his radio. The ambush unfolded with devastating efficiency. Chen's first shot took out Tank's front tire, sending the massive motorcycle into an uncontrolled skid that threw its rider clear and left him sprawling on the asphalt. The 2 following motorcycles tried to brake and change direction, but they were traveling too fast and following too closely to avoid the chaos created by Tank's crash. Deputy Miller and his officers opened fire from their concealed positions, their shots carefully aimed at the motorcycle's engines and tires rather than the riders themselves. The goal was incapacitation and capture rather than killing, though Harold had made it clear that lethal force was authorized if the suspects presented immediate threats to the injured students or emergency personnel. The second motorcycle, ridden by the man called Razor, went down hard as multiple bullets shredded its rear tire and punctured its fuel tank. Razor managed to roll clear of the wreckage, but he found himself surrounded by armed law enforcement officers before he could regain his footing. The third rider, Snake attempted to escape by turning his motorcycle around and racing back toward the county road. But Harold had anticipated this possibility and positioned himself to intercept exactly this kind of retreat attempt. His shot was precise and calculated, taking out the motorcycle's engine with a single well-placed round that caused it to coast to a stop about 50 yards from Harold's position. Snake abandoned his disabled motorcycle and tried to flee on foot, but Chun was already moving to intercept him. The 32-year-old soldier covered the ground between his position and Snake's location with the kind of speed and athleticism that comes from maintaining peak physical condition. Snake's attempt at resistance lasted approximately 3 seconds before Chun had him on the ground in handcuffs. Tank was slower to recover from his motorcycle crash, but when he finally struggled to his feet, he found himself facing Harold Martinez at a distance of approximately 20 feet. The elderly veteran held his pistol with steady hands and unwavering aim, his gray eyes carrying the kind of cold determination that suggested any aggressive movement would be met with immediate and overwhelming force. "Hello again, Tank," Harold said quietly. "I believe we have some unfinished business to discuss." Tank's face showed a mixture of pain from his crash injuries and stunned disbelief at finding himself outmaneuvered and captured by the same elderly man he'd been harassing in the diner less than an hour earlier. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, and his leather jacket was torn from his slide across the asphalt. "You," Tank gasped, his voice carrying notes of genuine fear for the first time in the entire encounter. How did I know you'd come back?" Harold finished the question calmly. "Because men like you always escalate. You couldn't leave well enough alone after our conversation in the diner, so you decided to take your frustration out on innocent people who couldn't defend themselves." Deputy Miller approached cautiously, handcuffs ready and his weapon drawn, but pointed away from the immediate confrontation. "Sergeant Major, we've got the other two in custody. This one's all yours." Harold never took his eyes off Tank as he responded. "Actually, Deputy, this one belongs to the justice system now. I'm just making sure he doesn't hurt anyone else while you complete the arrest." Tank raised his hands slowly, finally, understanding that a situation was hopeless and that any further resistance would likely result in serious injury or death. "Look, old man, I don't know what you think I did, but I think you attacked a school bus full of children," Harold interrupted, his voice carrying deadly seriousness. "I think you endangered the lives of 12 young people who never did anything to harm you. And I think you came back here planning to finish what you started." Tank's face went pale as he realized that his actions had been correctly interpreted and that he was facing charges far more serious than simple harassment or assault. Attacking a school bus was a federal crime that carried mandatory sentences, and the evidence of his guilt was overwhelming. "We didn't mean for anyone to get seriously hurt," Tank said desperately. "It was just supposed to scare them, you know? We were angry about what happened at the diner, and we saw the bus, and it seemed like a good way to blow off steam." Harold's expression showed no sympathy for Tank's explanation. 12 people are in a hospital because you needed to blow off steam. 4 of them are seriously injured. And you came back here with what intention exactly? Tank's silence was answer enough. Harold could see in the man's eyes that his return to the crash site hadn't been motivated by concern for his victims or remorse for his actions. Whatever Tank had been planning, it wouldn't have improved the situation for anyone except himself and his companions. Deputy Miller stepped forward with his handcuffs. "Tank Johnson, you're under arrest for aggravated assault, terrorist threats, endangering the welfare of minors, and attempted murder. You have the right to remain silent." As Miller recited the Miranda warning, Harold holstered his weapon and stepped back to allow local law enforcement to complete the arrest procedure. The immediate threat had been neutralized, and the situation was now a matter for civilian courts rather than military action. Chin approached from where he'd secured Snake, his uniform showing signs of the brief struggle, but his expression calm and professional. "All 3 suspects in custody, Sergeant Major. No additional casualties, and the crime scene is secure." Harold nodded his approval. Outstanding work, Michael. Your tactical assessment and execution were exactly what the situation required. I'll learn from the best, Chin replied with obvious respect. That ambush was textbook perfect. They never had a chance once you positioned us correctly. Deputy Miller finished handcuffing Tank and began searching him for weapons, discovering a concealed pistol and a large knife that confirmed Harold's assessment about the suspect's dangerous intentions. Sergeant Major, I don't know how to thank you for your assistance. Without your tactical expertise, this situation could have been much worse. Harold looked toward the overturned bus where EMTs were still working to stabilize injured students for transport to local hospitals. The thanks belong to those young people and their families. We just did what needed to be done to keep them safe. As additional law enforcement units arrived to process the crime scene and transport the suspects, Harold and Chun found themselves with a few quiet moments to reflect on the rapid escalation of events that had transformed their peaceful breakfast into a tactical operation. Any regrets about getting involved? Chin asked quietly. Harold considered the question while watching EMTs carefully load an injured student into an ambulance. None whatsoever. Those children needed help, and we were in a position to provide it. That's what service means, whether you're wearing a uniform or not. The sound of helicopter rotors announced the arrival of the state police air support, though their assistance was no longer needed for the immediate tactical situation. Harold watched the aircraft circle the crash site and couldn't help but think about how different this morning had been from his usual routine of quiet coffee and friendly conversation at the diner. Think Sandra saved us any breakfast? Chin asked with a slight smile as they walked back toward the Humvee. Harold chuckled. The first moment of levity in what had been a very intense hour. I suspect we'll find out soon enough. But first, we need to provide statements to Detective Anderson and make sure the prosecutor has everything necessary to put these individuals away for a very long time. As they drove away from the crash site, Harold reflected on the strange series of events that had led from Tank's harassment in the diner to his arrest for attacking a school bus. It was a perfect example of how small acts of aggression and disrespect could escalate into serious crimes when left unchecked. But it was also a demonstration of how training, experience, and moral courage could make the difference between tragedy and justice when circumstances demanded immediate action. Harold had no illusions about his age or physical limitations, but he'd proven to himself and others that some qualities, judgment, tactical thinking, and commitment to protecting innocent people didn't diminish with retirement. The day was still young, and Harold suspected that there would be more complications before the legal proceedings were complete and Tank and his companions were safely in custody, awaiting trial. But for the moment, the immediate crisis had been resolved, and the children on that school bus would have the chance to recover from their injuries and continue with their lives. That was worth any amount of disruption to his usual morning routine. 3 weeks after the incident on Highway 47, Harold Martinez sat in the same corner booth at the diner where everything had started, reading the morning newspaper with his usual cup of black coffee. The front page carried a story about Tang Johnson's sentencing hearing, scheduled for the following week, and the expected federal charges that would likely send him and his companions to prison for the next 15 to 20 years. Sandra approached with the coffee pot, and a smile that had become even warmer since the morning when Harold and Sergeant Chun had intervened to stop what could have been a much more serious tragedy. The usual this morning, Harold? That sounds perfect, Harold replied, folding the newspaper and setting it aside. How are the Martinez family doing? I heard young Roberto got accepted to that engineering program he wanted. Sandra's face lit up with the kind of pride that made Harold remember why he'd chosen to make this small community his home. He did. Full scholarship, too, thanks to that letter of recommendation you wrote for him. I don't know how we can ever thank you for taking the time to help him with his application. Harold waved off her gratitude with gentle modesty. Roberto earned that scholarship through his own hard work and dedication. I just provided some perspective on his character and potential. The accomplishment belongs entirely to him. The conversation was interrupted by the familiar sound of the diner's front door opening, but this time the arrival brought smiles rather than tension. Sergeant Chun entered in civilian clothes, followed by a young woman in her early 20s wearing a college sweatshirt and walking with the aid of cane. "Sergeant Major," Chun said with obvious pleasure, "I'd like you to meet someone very special." Harold stood slowly as they approached his table, immediately recognizing the young woman despite never having seen her before. She had the kind of determined expression and obvious intelligence that reminded him of the best soldiers he'd commanded during his military career. "This is Jessica Morrison," Chun continued, "one of the students who was on the bus that day. She's been asking to meet you ever since she got out of the hospital." Jessica extended her hand with a firm grip that spoke of inner strength and resilience. "Sergeant Major Martinez, I wanted to thank you personally for what you did. The doctor said that if those men had come back to the crash site like they planned, several of us probably wouldn't have survived our injuries." Harold shook her hand gently, noting the surgical scar on her arm and the way she favored her left leg, despite her obvious effort to move normally. "How are you recovering, Miss Morrison? I hope the physical therapy is going well." "Better every day," she replied with the kind of optimism that Harold had learned to associate with people who'd faced serious challenges and emerged stronger. "I'll be back to full strength by the time classes start next semester. And I'll be studying criminal justice, partly because of what I learned about real heroes during this whole experience." Harold felt the familiar discomfort that came with being praised for actions he considered basic moral obligations. "I'm not a hero, Jessica. I'm just someone who was in the right place at the right time, with the training necessary to help." "That's exactly what makes you a hero," she replied firmly. "You could have stayed out of it. You could have let someone else handle the situation. But you chose to get involved because people needed help, even though it put you at risk." Chin pulled out a chair and gestured for Jessica to sit down. "She's been researching your military record, Sergeant Major. Apparently, she's writing a paper for her political science class about modern military leadership and civilian responsibility." Harold sat back down with obvious reluctance to be the subject of academic study. "I hope you're including other examples in your research, Jessica. Individual actions are less important than the principles and training that makes such actions possible when they're needed." "Actually," Jessica said, pulling out a notebook from her backpack, "that's exactly what I'm writing about. How military training creates people who respond to emergencies with competence and moral courage, even decades after their service ends. Your actions that morning weren't random or accidental. They were the result of years of preparation and a commitment to service that extends beyond wearing a uniform." Sandra appeared with Harold's breakfast and additional coffee for Chun and Jessica, her face showing obvious pleasure at seeing the reunion between Harold and one of the students he'd helped protect. "Breakfast for everyone? It's on the house, as usual." Harold started to protest the continued generosity, but Sandra held up her hand with mock sternness. "Don't even think about arguing with me, Harold Martinez. This diner's reputation was built on taking care of people who take care of others. You and Sergeant Chun earned free breakfast for life that morning." As Sandra bustled away to prepare additional orders, Jessica opened her notebook and looked at Harold with obvious interest. "Would you mind if I asked you some questions about leadership and decision-making under pressure? I'm trying to understand how someone develops the kind of judgment you showed that day." Harold sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "What specifically are you hoping to learn? How did you know that Tank and his friends would come back to the crash site? Most people would have assumed they'd fled the area and wouldn't return to the scene of their crime." Harold considered the question carefully before answering. Experience with criminal behavior and tactical thinking. Men like Tank operate from emotion rather than logic, and they rarely consider the long-term consequences of their actions. When someone challenges their sense of dominance or control, they usually escalate rather than retreat. Chin nodded his agreement. In military terms, they were tactically predictable. Their behavior at the diner showed a pattern of aggression and poor judgment that made their subsequent actions almost inevitable. But how do you prepare for something like that? Jessica asked, "How do you organize an effective response to a situation you've never encountered before?" Harold smiled slightly. Every situation is new in its specific details, but the principles remain constant. Assess the threat, protect innocent people, use available resources efficiently, and maintain calm decision-making under pressure. Those skills transfer from military combat to civilian emergencies. What about the moral aspect? Jessica pressed. "You're a retired civilian. You had no legal obligation to get involved in that situation. What made you decide to take the risk?" The question touched on something Harold had been thinking about frequently since the incident. Service doesn't end with retirement. Jessica, the oath to protect and defend includes protecting and defending the people in your community, regardless of whether you're being paid to do it or wearing a uniform. Chun leaned forward with obvious interest. "I've been wondering about that myself, Sergeant Major. At what point did you decide that this was something you needed to handle personally rather than just providing information to local authorities?" Harold ate a bite of his eggs while considering his response. When it became clear that those children were in immediate danger and local law enforcement didn't have the tactical experience necessary to handle the situation effectively. At that point, personal risk became secondary to mission requirements. Mission requirements? Jessica asked. But this wasn't an official military mission. Every situation where innocent people need protection becomes a mission, Harold replied simply. The source of authority matters less than the immediate need for competent action. Jessica scribbled notes rapidly, clearly excited by Harold's responses. That's exactly the kind of perspective I hope to capture in my paper. The idea that moral obligations create missions that exist independently of official orders or civilian job descriptions. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Deputy Miller, now wearing sergeant stripes that reflected a promotion he'd received partly based on his performance during the bus incident. He approached Harold's table with obvious respect and a manila folder tucked under his arm. "Sergeant Major, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. I wanted to update you on the legal proceedings and get your input on a related matter." Harold gestured to an empty chair. "Please join us, Sergeant Miller. This is Jessica Morrison, one of the students from the bus, and I believe you've met Sergeant Chun." Miller shook hands with Jessica and nodded to Chun before sitting down. "Miss Morrison, I'm glad to see you're recovering well. How are the other students doing?" "Everyone's back in school, except for two who are still doing physical therapy for their leg injuries," Jessica replied. "But all the doctors say we'll make full recoveries, thanks to how quickly emergency care was provided that day." Miller opened his folder and pulled out several official-looking documents. "That's actually part of what I wanted to discuss. The district attorney is finalizing the plea agreements for Tank Johnson and his associates, but there's been an interesting development in the federal case." Harold raised an eyebrow. "What kind of development?" "The FBI has connected Tank's group to at least 3 similar incidents in other states over the past 6 months. Apparently, they've been traveling around the country targeting school buses and other civilian targets as part of some kind of domestic terrorism campaign." Chen's expression darkened. "You're saying this wasn't just a random act of violence motivated by their confrontation at the diner?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Miller confirmed. "The bus attack was planned in advance as part of their travel route. The diner incident just provided them with additional motivation and a specific target for their anger." Jessica looked horrified. "You mean they came to this town specifically to hurt children?" Miller nodded grimly. "Among other targets. They had a list of potential sites including schools, community centers, and veteran organizations. Your school bus just happened to be the most convenient target on their schedule." Harold felt a cold anger building in his chest as he processed this information. "How many casualties in the other incidents?" 14 deaths, 37 serious injuries across 3 states, Miller replied quietly. "All targeting civilians, mostly young people, and elderly individuals who couldn't defend themselves effectively." The magnitude of what had been prevented that morning was beginning to sink in for everyone at the table. Tank and his companions hadn't been petty criminals acting out of temporary frustration. They've been serial terrorists with a deliberate strategy of targeting vulnerable populations. The federal prosecutor wants to discuss the possibility of additional charges based on the domestic terrorism statutes, Miller continued. And he's specifically interested in Harold's testimony about their behavior patterns and tactical capabilities. Harold nodded slowly. Whatever the prosecution needs to ensure these individuals never have the opportunity to hurt anyone else. There's something else, Miller said, his voice carrying a note of official formality. The FBI wants to consult with you about developing training programs for local law enforcement dealing with domestic terrorism incidents. Apparently, your tactical assessment and response that morning is being studied as a model for rural agencies facing similar situations. Shin smiled with obvious pride. They want the sergeant major to teach other people how to think like he does in crisis situations. Harold looked uncomfortable with the attention, but understanding of the practical necessity. If my experience can help other communities protect themselves more effectively, I'm happy to share whatever knowledge might be useful. Jessica had been taking notes throughout the conversation, and now she looked up with obvious excitement. This is exactly what my paper is about, how individual competence and moral courage create ripple effects that benefit entire communities and even influence national security policies. Speaking of ripple effects, Miller said with a slight smile, there's one more thing you should know. The governor is planning to present you with the state's highest civilian honor for valor. Apparently, your actions that morning meet the criteria for exceptional bravery in the protection of innocent life. Harold groaned quietly. I really wish people wouldn't make such a big deal out of basic civic responsibility. Basic civic responsibility? Jessica laughed. Harold, you organized and executed a tactical operation that neutralized 3 armed domestic terrorists and prevented mass casualties. That's not basic anything. That's extraordinary. Sandra appeared at their table with fresh coffee and the obvious intention of joining the conversation. What's extraordinary is that we're lucky enough to live in a community where people like Harold and Sergeant Chun are available when we need them most. Harold looked around the table at the faces of people who'd become important.